Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. The last I heard, you were doing the Massey lecture series on CBC.
I did do that.
And very well done.
Oh, thanks.
I might say. The theme of that, of course, was why ancient knowledge matters in the modern world. Is that a theme you'll be touching on here?
Totally. I mean, the lecture tonight will basically those 5 Massey lectures folded into one.
Ah, okay.
And illustrated by photography.
Ah, okay. It's a bit of a multimedia show.
Yeah.
Refresh my memory. The course of that lecture, sort of, a lot of it was had to do with navigation.
Well, it's really. I mean, the origin of this is when I'm an anthropologist, but when the National Geographic turned into its 2nd century, it sort of asked itself what was its mission going to be. In the 1st century, its mission was sort of to tell you about the world, and then from the very top, they decided that its mission was going to be sort of to help you save the world through conservation. And so they brought the explorers in residence. You couldn't apply for it. They selected you from around the world. So Jane Goodall for primatology, and Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, for marine oceanography, and my closest friend Johann Reinhardt, who's a high-altitude archaeologist who found the ice maiden, partially preserved Incan maiden, and they brought me on as a social anthropologist. And of course, when you think of conservation of plants or animals, you can make a protected area, but you can't make a reinforced park at the mine. So the question is, how do you draw people's attention to the fact that we're living through a time when half the language of the world are disappearing within a generation? And our solution really was that all you could really attempt to do is sort of change the way the world viewed and valued culture. And the best way to do that was not through politics or polemics, but through storytelling. So I sort of set out to take the audience to places where, not to celebrate the exotic other, but rather to go to places where the way people lived or had lived illustrated kind of a central lesson of anthropology. And that's the idea that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're unique answers to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And what I tried to do with the Massey lectures was sort of take this incredible revelation of genetics, which has finally proven it to be true, that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth. Race has been exposed as a total fiction. All human populations are descended from the same people who walked out of Africa. Every human population shares the same raw genetic endowment, and therefore, by definition, the same raw human genius, right? And so how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of orientation and choice and cultural priorities, so that it finally puts to lie to the old 19th century idea, which kind of anthropology inspired, that there was some kind of ladder of success, that went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand in London. This scheme that invariably placed European society at the apex of a pyramid that went down to the so-called primitives of the world, and it showed that that was completely meaningless and as much an artifact of the 19th century as the idea that clergymen had that the earth was only 6,000 years old. Right? And yet, so if you accept that everybody has the same raw genius, how they use a genius is simply a matter of choice. So you suddenly realize the real consequence of losing, because when you say you're losing half the language of the world, I mean, that's a pretty serious statistic. And there's no linguist who doubts that fundamental statistic, which is interesting, because in biology, for example, people are always, no one even knows how many species there are, let alone real rates of extinction. And there's a lot of debate back and forth. But here everybody's saying, okay, half, and a language is just an expression of a culture. So,
embodiment of, yeah.
Yeah, so okay, if that's true, we're losing half of humanity's intellectual and social legacy in a generation. That's a pretty serious thing. And so what I then tried to do is sort of illustrate the significance of that by going out to places to show how if you will, the human genius had been used in different ways. So that's why I went to Polynesia, to look at this extraordinary tradition of navigation, whereby, at a time when European sailors, for fear of the open ocean and because of their inability to solve the problem of longitude, hugged the shores of continents. Here are these Polynesians who went out on these open voyages, settling the biggest ocean on Earth, and doing so based on dead reckoning. And dead reckoning means you only know where you are by remembering how you got there. And it was the impossibility of an long open ocean voyage that kept Europeans from setting sail, with the exception of some really inspired navigators like Captain Cook and others, But in general, European shipping was afraid of the open ocean until the development of the chronometer and so. But the fascinating thing about it is that, of course, the Polynesian navigators had no written word. And dead reckoning means that over the course of one of those long journeys, you had to remember every change of wind, every shift of current, so you knew exactly where and how you'd gotten to where you were. Well, that's a remarkable feat of memory over the course of a 3-week journey. And so, as I said in the lectures and in the book, you can think of it as you take all the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and apply it to an understanding of the ocean, what you get is Polynesia. So in everything I do, I'm never denigrating our own culture. Our culture is wonderful. If I ripped my arm off in a car accident this afternoon, I wouldn't want to be taken to an herbalist, But on the other hand, we're not the paragon of humanity's potential. And these other cultures aren't failed attempts at being us. They've all got something to say to the world. And so another trip, for example, we did, we looked, for example, we went to Peru and sort of examined the idea of sacred geography, again, not in the spirit of hippie ethnography, but very much looking at what does it really mean when a people believe the earth is alive and responsive to the human imagination, or inversely, that human beings have reciprocal obligations to the earth, so that you're raised here in Kamloops to believe that that mountain's a pile of rock ready to be mined. That makes you a different kid than a kid in the Andes who believes it's an Apu spirit that's going to direct your destiny. The interesting thing is not who's right and who's wrong, but how the belief system affects the interaction between human beings and the environment, and in that case, the ecological footprint of the society, right? Or we did another film which we call The Buddhist Science of the Mind, and why would you use the word science for a religion? Well, what is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? What is Buddhism but 2,500 years of direct observation as to the nature of mind? And in fact, the Buddhists would say that the proof of the science of the mind is the serenity achieved by the individual who follows the fourth noble truth, which is the contemplative practice that they believe actually allows you to reach enlightenment. So in that film, for example, we had learned of a woman who had gone into lifelong retreat as a young girl, and she was ill and being treated by a traditional doctor, and this gave us the opportunity to go and interview her. And so literally in the film, the door opens on the face of a woman who'd been essentially in isolation in a small cell for 45 years, devoting her entire earthly existence to the recitation of a single mantra. Now, by the terms of reference of our culture, if I put you in a cupboard for 45 years, you'd be stark raving mad. And it was fascinating to watch this door open on the face of a woman who'd been in isolation like that, and what emerged was not someone mad, but someone whose eyes sparkled with delight and grace. And of course, for the Buddhists, she is a proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind, the serenity achieved by those who follow that path. And that's why a Lama that we quoted in that film famously said to us, we in Tibet don't believe you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieved enlightenment in our lifetime, but we do. And ultimately, the point of all this is not because, it's not an issue of human rights, or certainly it's not about, romantic nostalgia. It's really about geopolitical stability, because culture is not trivial or decorative. Culture is what, allows people to find kind of order and meaning in their lives. And so when you're living through a period of such chaos, where languages are being lost, yet the individual survives to sort of shadow their former self, torn from the constraints of tradition, often sort of, placing themselves by coercion or by their own volition on the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere. The result is disaffection, anger, all the things that we see fuel the crazy places in the world. And so, one of the things that cultures have always been kind of guilty of. not just the American culture, which is famously sort of full of itself in a way, or ethnocentric, you might call it. You know? But we're all ethnocentric. You know, I mean, one of the real curses of humanity is this kind of cultural myopia that all peoples have had. You know, most tribal societies, their name means the people. The implication being that, you know, those other mucks and schmucks over there, you know, are savages beyond the pale. And so that happens on the level of the tribal society. It happens on the level of the nation state, where you know America thinks, you know, or whoever. And one of the arguments I try to make is that in a pluralistic world, that old thing of cultural myopia is something we can't really tolerate. I mean, the word barbarian comes from the Greek barbarous, one who babbles. So if you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. But the Aztec had the same idea, you know, with Nahuatl. So part of what all of this work of the geographic is all really saying, well, let's be conscious of what's going on and recognize that when these societies and languages are lost, something is lost to all of us. But at the same time, no one's talking about freezing people in time. It's not about the traditional versus the modern, or about us going backward, as people think of it, but really the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. Like in the Canadian Arctic, the skidoo, or the snowmobile, arrived in Baffin Island in 1962. Quickly adopted. And it also arrived in Greenland, but in an incredible, you know, kind of, I don't know how they came up with this idea, but in the northernmost community of polar Eskimo, you know, in Canada, Eskimo is kind of a pejorative term now. Yeah. It's not in Greenland. So when I say polar Eskimo, that's what they call themselves. But in Connacht, which is this very cool place, the northernmost community in the world, in extreme northwestern Greenland, if you go to Connacht, you know, and there's got wonderful little Danish houses, and they've got, you know, a great supermarket, and they've got a great co-op, and they've got a great elder center and great medical facilities. Everybody's got DVDs, everybody's got cell phones, but they have dogs, and they recognized that dogs were the cultural pivot, and so they banned skidoos. And what they realized is that they could have all those other aspects of their lives change, but they would not lose their essential selves as long as they ran dogs, because, you know, for a number of reasons, you know, the dogs allowed them to maintain a higher degree of independence from the cash economy, allowed you to go out onto the land indefinitely, and the very act of keeping dogs, like 30,000 dogs around the town, you know, demanded skills that kept you tied into traditional skills that only you had and your fathers or your grandfathers had. It's just a very cool example of where a culture has really made a choice. And so they have the best of the modern, the best of the old, and as a result, frankly, the society is a whole lot saner with a lot less pathology than you would find in Inuit settlements in the Canadian North, I would say, you know. And that's what Hugh Brody is, a wonderful Canadian anthropologist. Oh, he's actually British, but he writes mostly, you know, about Canada and the Arctic. But he had a wonderful phrase where, you know, it's not the traditional versus the modern, but the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. So no one's expecting to hold the hideout frozen in time, you know, expecting them to be wearing cedar bark, you know. But the question is, you know, why should something essentially haida not be allowed to persist in a pluralistic, multicultural mosaic like Canada?
Right.
And of course, not only not allowed to exist, we all benefit from it. And that's sort of a cool thing that Canada has come to understand. I mean, that's the richness of Canada. I mean, where would you rather live? Toronto in 1950, where your choice of food was mashed potatoes or boiled potatoes, or Toronto today, where you know, the whole world's there. Right.
Well, we've come a long way since the potlucks were banned.
Yeah, no kidding.
But we're still losing our language, our indigenous languages, at a frightening rate, including in this region. So I was wondering if you're going to tailor your speech a bit to, because this is an institutional choice for Aboriginals.
Yeah, no, which I think is very cool about this university. The fact you've got a third foreign students, a third focus on Aboriginal. I mean, it's